All right. Hey, nerds. So, I'm going to continue my series on John Caputo's book, The Post Structuralist Christian Philosopher. His book called Heidegger and Aquinas, obviously about Heidegger and Aquinas. And remember, post-structuralists are kind of more what people who are strawmanned by Jordan Peterson as postmodern neo-Marxists all the time, even though kind of like not many philosophers are postmodernists. Some of them are so post-structuralists. So anyway, John D. Caputo is a postmodernist Christian, I would say, like actually a postmodernist rather than a post-structuralist. So he wrote the book Heidegger and Aquinas, an essay on metaphysics, which I've been talking about a lot, right? And I've been talking about metaphysics in other contexts and other books with other philosophers as well, obviously, right? Like Kant, for example, and we get into that here. So, and remember that metaphysics is the philosophical study and speculation about the cosmic nature, structure, and function of the universe. So remember, I've mentioned Heidegger many times before too. He was a 20th century philosopher who studied phenomenology and metaphysics. And remember that phenomenology is essentially the study of a first person experience of consciousness. Now, in this passage that I'm going to get into in Heidegger and Aquinas here is John D. Caputo explaining Heidegger's opinion on Kant, which is a critique of Kant's perspective on logic. So, remember, Kant was a really super famous seminal 1700s Enlightenment philosopher who wrote about subjects like reason, knowledge, metaphysics, faith, and morality. And Caputo also talks about Heidegger's opinion of Schopenhauer here, and I'm not sure whether I don't remember correctly whether he actually founded pessimism, but he's a very seminal figure in pessimism. I'm just going to read a bit of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on Schopenhauer here, and then on his critique of Kant as well. So, Arthur Schopenhauer was among the first 19th century philosophers to contend that at its core, the universe is not a rational place. So kind of makes it sound like he's agreeing with Heidegger about the flaws of logic, right? Inspired by Plato and Kant, of course, one of the probably the most famous philosopher of all time, Plato, ancient Greek philosopher, both of whom regarded the world as being more amenable to reason. But so Schopenhauer disagreed with Plato and Kant about that, obviously. Schopenhauer developed their philosophies into an instinct recognizing and ultimately ascetic outlook, emphasizing that in the face of a world filled with endless strife, we ought to minimize our natural desires for the sake of achieving a more tranquil frame of mind and a disposition towards universal beneficence. That sounds pretty fucking great to me, man. Often considered to be a thoroughgoing pessimist, which that doesn't sound that pessimistic for a pessimist to me. So that shows you that, as I know because I've read Schopenhauer's book called On Pessimism, pessimism isn't actually like cynicism as what it would be, what the like cosmopolitan definition of it would be. You can even say the same thing of cynics and nihilists, but we don't need to get into that here. Anyway, Schopenhauer, in fact, advocated ways via artistic, moral, and aesthetic forms of awareness to overcome a frustration-filled and fundamentally painful human condition. Since his death in 1860, his philosophy has had a special attraction for those who wonder about life's meaning, along with those engaged in music, literature, and the visual arts. So I'm going to talk, I'm just going to go to Schopenhauer's critique of Kant here, which I think is really interesting. Okay, so Schopenhauer can be called a Kantian in many respects, but he did not always agree with the details of Kant's arguments. As noted, Schopenhauer's teacher, I don't need to get into that. Schopenhauer's teacher wrote a book that contains a criticism of a Kantian philosopher, which is pretty loose connection. So one of Kant's teachers wrote a book that contains a criticism of Kant, and one of his other teachers and mentors, one of Schopenhauer's other teachers and mentors was Reinhold, who is a defender of Kant. So he was influenced by both people who were critical of Kant and people who defended Kant, Schopenhauer was. And he was known for his philosophy of the elements. Schopenhauer that was expressed along with some earlier writings. So that's like his perspective on pessimism is actually kind of interesting, right? So with that in mind, now that we know who Heidegger and Kant and Schopenhauer are, I'll get into Caputo's passage about Heidegger's opinion of Kant's perspective on logic. So this is some more inception philosophy here, especially with all the details that Heidegger goes into in the paragraph. All right, so the problem of logic. As we have seen, Heidegger's interest in those early years ultimately centered on the problems of logic, a fact which may appear surprising today, but when the more carefully examined is quite understandable. He talked about the flaws of logic, which I find really interesting, of course, because building like logically consistent arguments is important, but a lot of people, like scientific rationalists, for example, of course, always exaggerate the importance of logic and don't focus as much on like emotions and aesthetic principles and wisdom and living a simple life and that stuff, which is not any better or worse than logic necessarily, but very different and just as important. So anyway, Heidegger's interest in these early years ultimately centered on the problems of logic, a fact which may appear surprising today, but when more carefully examined is quite understandable. He was interested in the constellation of problems surrounding the foundations of logic, which he no doubt encountered initially in the first volume of his book, The Logical Investigations. He disputed the prejudice of the two dominant schools of thought with which he was in contact, Neo-Kantianism and Neo-Scholasticism, that logic was a finished system. Yeah, like these philosophers who get like really fucking autistically focused on the philosophy of logic. He's about to get into how kind of stupidly detailed they get about that, in my opinion. So remember, we talked about before in this book too, Caputo is saying that Heidegger was very critical of both Neo-Kantianism and Neo-Scholasticism, and basically he means like Neo-Catholic, Neo-Classic. What's the word I'm looking for? Catholic Neo-Scholasticism. So like academia and stuff, and he didn't like either of those schools in philosophy and in theology. So he's critical of both of them. But obviously he's talking about Kant here right now. So Neo-Kantian and Neo-Scholasticism basically stated that logic was a finished system. The Scholastics they claimed anyway. The Scholastics claimed to have so thoroughly canonized the Aristotelian syllogistic. Obviously, Plato and Socrates preceded Aristotle, and he was another very ancient Greek philosopher and very seminal and very concerned with logic, right? Like just like Plato and Socrates, of course, and countless others like militant atheists and scientific rationalists and all that kind of shit, right? And materialists. Anyway, so the Scholastics had so thoroughly canonized the Aristotelian syllogistic that the study of logic amounted to no more than learning the ancient formulas and such acronyms as Barbarus Celerant. So if you learn all these formulas of logic, and then that's just how logic works, of course that's stupid because humans do not behave rationally, as Schopenhauer, I think, accurately fucking points out. We remember this from the social psychologists and moral psychologists who have often mentioned before, Jonathan Haidt, in his studies about moral, that he's both participated in and promoted, called moral foundations theory, which is basically based on scientific studies showing that we actually behave and think based on our intuitions, and then we rationalize forward from our intuition. So we can try to think better by practicing critical thinking, but we're never rational people. We can behave in rational ways and be rational, but that's going against human nature, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's not necessarily a good thing either. So anyway, let's continue here. Right. So the Scholastics had so thoroughly canonized the Aristotelian syllogistic that the study of logic amounted to no more than learning the ancient formulas and acronyms. So Heidegger saw clearly that formal logic had been considerably expanded by the class calculus of Russell and Whitehead and by the logic of relations. But this was not the essential innovation of the old logic which interested him. Remember, Bertrand Russell is an also an extremely famous Enlightenment, I would say, kind of rationalist philosopher, perhaps. But another interesting aspect of him is that he was very critical of the use of nuclear weapons in World War II, just like Einstein was. So, and remember, Alfred North Whitehead, he coined the idea of an immanent God, basically, which is similar to other theological conceptions of God, or any other conceptions of God in other religions, which is this idea that rather than God being like, omniscient, omnipresent, etc., God is not all powerful and all knowing, and we can change God just as much as God changes us, basically. But also, Russell and Wright, like I've said before, Alfred North Whitehead was, in addition to a philosopher, he was also a mathematician. And so he was really also fucking extremely too concerned with logic. And Alfred North Whitehead and Bertrand Russell wrote a book together, which was all like obsessed with formal logic. And it's like, read it if you're interested, but only if you want to get way too in the weeds on the philosophy of logic. So anyway, the class calculus of Russell and Whitehead, and by the logic of relations. But this was not the essential innovation on the old logic which interested him. Quote, the deeper meaning of the principles remains in darkness, the deeper meaning of the principles of logic. The calculus of judgment, for example, is a calculating with judgments. But so you have to use judgments to decide which calculations you make and how they make them and for what reason, right? So, but logistics is not the problem of the theory of judgment. That's what it is, basically. Heidegger is concerned not with the technical advances made in logic since the latter half of the 19th century, but with the questions of the logical theory which arose mainly in connection with the debate over psychologism and the refutation of the psychologistic interpretation of Kant, first proposed by Schopenhauer. Remember, psychologism is like basically using psychological explanations for things, which is similar to what I said in terms of Jonathan Haidt, but not exactly that. And it's interesting because, so I mentioned Schopenhauer before, right? And psychologism is, a lot of philosophers use different ideas of psychologism and follow different psychologists. A lot of them often comment on Freud, like my favorite 70s pervert post-structuralist philosopher Foucault, of course, for example. But I mean, I think that's kind of an oversimplified way to look at behavior and people in philosophy. A lot of aspects of philosophy are very good, but also very flawed. But anyway, and remember Slavoj Žižek, for example, my favorite Hegelian / Lacanian / Marxist philosopher, is a Lacanian rather than a Freudian. So he likes Lacan's opinion on philosophy and psychoanalysis more than Freud's opinion on psychoanalysis, basically. But anyway, so Schopenhauer first proposed a psychologistic interpretation of Kant, which is interesting because we know that Heidegger was very critical of logic, right? And Schopenhauer as well. So we know that Schopenhauer was really critical of logic, but he also developed his own, ironically, I would say, because it's not the same thing, but very similar, a psychologistic interpretation of Kant. So Schopenhauer is interested not Schopenhauer, Heidegger is interested not in deductive techniques, but in the, quote, essence, unquote, of logic. What is logic? He asks. We already stand before a problem whose solution is reserved for the future. Maybe we'll figure this out in the future. We don't fully understand the true nature of logic now, the underlying foundation of it. We already stand before a problem whose solution is reserved for the future. He wanted his scholastic as well as his neo-Kantian contemporaries to ask this question again, to raise it anew, and not to settle for the old and established ways of thinking about it. What an idea! Explore philosophy more as a philosophy. As a philosopher, you'd think that would be just a thing that they would do. So, and this is the problem with academia, basically, right? So, anyway, and that's always a good idea. So, that is the thrust of the review entitled Recent Investigations into Logic, which he published in 1912. So, basically, I think Heidegger makes an excellent point. Philosophers of logic shouldn't just say, yeah, we've got logic all figured out, man. You just follow these formulas and acronyms, and yeah, that's just logical thinking in a nutshell. That's all you need to do. But obviously, you guys know from watching my videos, and any of you who study philosophy, that it's a hell of a lot more complex than that. If you want to be a good philosopher, you should always keep asking foundational, fundamental questions, even if they seem too simple to consider. And even if you've had your ideology figured out already, just so you can check to make sure that you don't have like more biases and thinking errors that you need, because people can't be logical, but we can practice critical thinking in an attempt to behave more rationally, even though it's impossible to be entirely rational all the time, right? But anyway, I think Heidegger makes a really excellent point. We need to go back to the start and the foundation of logic and say, what is the true nature of logic? So tell me in the comments, do you think that Heidegger fucking destroyed logic with his criticism? I think he makes a good criticism, but not exactly destroys it. And Kant has some really good points, but he was way too obsessed with logic too. And it's very interesting that Schopenhauer criticized logic a lot, but also was interested in a psychologistic interpretation of Kant and also criticized him. But anyway, yeah, in a nutshell, let's ask ourselves, what is logic? Just ask yourself that and let me know in the comments. I'm sure a lot of you will give really simple answers. What is logic?